Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. Germany today stands at a profound crossroads, a nation that has chosen principle over comfort, solidarity over expedience, and now finds itself paying the economic price. Its economy, the engine of Europe for more than half a century, is faltering under the twin burdens of energy disruption and moral responsibility. The question haunting Berlin is no longer whether its support for Ukraine was right, but whether the structure of its own prosperity can survive the consequences of that choice. To understand Germany's economic distress, one must separate myth from mechanism. The easy narrative that the support for Ukraine alone has wrecked the German economy misses the deeper truth. Berlin's current pain is the exposure of an economic model long dependent on forces beyond its control. For decades, Germany's prosperity rested on three pillars: cheap Russian energy, Chinese demand, and fiscal orthodoxy. Each of those foundations has eroded, revealing an uncomfortable fragility beneath the facade of strength. When Russia's pipelines went dark, the shock was more than the loss of gas. It was a revelation. The entire German industrial system, from BASF's chemical complexes in Ludwigshafen to the machine tool corridors of Baden-Württemberg, had been built around predictable low-cost inputs. The war in Ukraine transformed that stability into volatility overnight. Natural gas imports had to be rerouted, as LNG costing 2 to 3 times more per unit, while inflationary pressure rippled through every sector of the supply chain. The Mittelstand, long the quiet backbone of German innovation, suddenly found itself gasping for oxygen in a market it no longer recognized. But the energy story is only half the equation. The geopolitical reorientation demanded by the Ukraine conflict has fractured Germany's commercial ecosystem. China, once the most reliable export destination for German machinery, cars, and industrial components, is decoupling either by choice or necessity. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, offering lavish subsidies for green manufacturing, has tempted German firms to relocate investments across the Atlantic. The very globalization that once empowered Germany now threatens to hollow it out. What remains is a society caught between two imperatives: the moral duty to defend a European order based on law and the material duty to preserve its citizens' well-being. Chancellor Scholz's government, navigating this tension, faces a paradox Sachs would describe as the burden of moral leadership in an age of material fatigue. Germans, known for their patience and pragmatism, are beginning to question whether their solidarity with Kyiv must come at the expense of their own livelihoods. And yet Sachs would caution this pain must not be mistaken for failure. Every great transformation extracts a toll before it yields renewal. The collapse of old dependencies on Russian hydrocarbons, on Chinese growth, on American protection could, if wisely managed, birth a new model of European resilience: energy autonomous, digitally advanced, and socially cohesive. The challenge is not simply to endure the costs of solidarity, but to convert them into investments in independence. For now, Germany's economic struggles reveal a truth that transcends statistics. Principles have prices. The question that will define the next decade is whether Germany can turn that price into purpose, whether it can prove, as Sachs often reminds us, that moral economies, when designed with vision, can be both ethical and efficient. Germany's post-war miracle was not merely economic, it was moral. It rested on an implicit covenant between state, labor, and capital that prosperity would be shared, sacrifice distributed fairly, and the dignity of work preserved. That covenant is now being tested as the costs of solidarity with Ukraine ripple through German society. What was once a proud consensus, the belief that economic sacrifice could serve a higher European cause, is beginning to erode under the pressure of stagnation, inflation, and uncertainty. In every cafe and workshop, in the dormitories of students, in the homes of pensioners, the same quiet question lingers. How long must we pay for this war? It is not a question of sympathy for Russia, but one of fatigue, a weariness born from years of crisis layered upon crisis. The pandemic drained household savings, energy inflation burned through real wages. Now geopolitical confrontation has added moral complexity to material hardship. Jeffrey Sachs would describe this as the politics of endurance. In every society, solidarity depends on stamina, the capacity of ordinary citizens to bear costs for abstract principles. Germans have long been capable of this, perhaps more than any other people in Europe, but their patience is not infinite. When monthly energy bills rise faster than wages, when small manufacturers shut their furnaces because gas costs have tripled, when municipalities must choose between welfare programs and refugee assistance, the moral calculus begins to shift. This is not yet rebellion, but it is resentment, a subtle growing disillusionment that populist forces have learned to exploit. The far-right alternative for Deutschland, AfD, once a fringe movement, now polls in double digits across industrial regions hardest hit by the energy crisis. Its rhetoric is simple but effective. Berlin helps Kyiv while you freeze. The center-left Social Democrats and the Greens, who championed Ukraine's cause, now face a delicate balance between principle and pragmatism. Every decision to extend sanctions, every new package of aid risks becoming a domestic political grenade. Yet the danger Sachs would warn against is not just electoral, it is moral fragmentation. The longer economic pain endures, the more society begins to lose sight of the purpose behind its sacrifice. The moral narrative that Germany is defending European peace and sovereignty must be constantly reaffirmed, not through slogans, but through tangible fairness. Citizens will endure hardship if they believe it is shared. They will revolt if they feel it is imposed. To prevent this unraveling, the government must communicate not in abstractions, but in honesty. The cost of solidarity should be acknowledged, not hidden. Relief measures must be visible, targeted, and just. Subsidies that favor large corporations while households struggle to heat their homes erode trust. By contrast, policies that cushion lower and middle-income families' energy rebates, transport support, and rent stabilization sustain the moral legitimacy of foreign policy. Sachs would call this the economics of empathy. The idea that successful governance is not measured by GDP, but by the citizens' perception of fairness. In this sense, Germany's real challenge is not inflation or recession, but the preservation of faith in democracy itself. Every shock tests whether the republic can hold its moral center, whether the state remains a guarantor of justice or becomes merely an administrator of austerity. The line between the two is fragile. What distinguishes Germany from other nations in crisis, Sachs might argue, is its historical memory. Germans understand the cost of moral surrender. They know what happens when despair replaces decency. If the government can harness that memory, transforming suffering into solidarity and fatigue into foresight, the current crisis could yet renew the social contract rather than shatter it. Because the danger is not that Germans will stop caring for Ukraine. The danger is that they will stop believing that caring for others can coexist with caring for themselves. The test ahead is not of compassion, but of confidence, whether the world's most disciplined democracy can rediscover amid exhaustion the strength to endure without losing its soul. Germany's predicament today is not simply economic, it is structural. The convergence of domestic limits and continental obligations. The government of Olaf Scholz, leading a fragile coalition of Social Democrats, Greens, and Free Democrats, governs within a shrinking space. The moral commitment to Ukraine collides with the fiscal conservatism of its own constitution, while Europe's solidarity agenda strains against national politics. Jeffrey Sachs would call this the constraint box of a tired empire of virtue, a system bound by principles that now compete with survival. Inside Berlin's ministries, the tension is palpable. The debt brake Schuldenbremse, enshrined in Germany's basic law, remains a symbol of post-war fiscal discipline. It limits deficit spending to a fraction of GDP, a rule born from the trauma of hyperinflation now colliding with the demands of a world at war and a planet in transition. To fund energy relief, military aid to Ukraine, and industrial modernization, the government has resorted to special funds and off-budget instruments, but these measures, legally fragile and politically explosive, reveal a deeper contradiction: a nation that insists on moral leadership abroad but hesitates to finance it at home. The coalition itself reflects the paradox. The Greens see Ukraine as a moral cause, a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, and are willing to tolerate economic pain for principle. The Social Democrats are torn between their pacifist heritage and the need to defend European order. The Free Democrats, fiscally orthodox and economically liberal, resist deficit spending even as industry cries out for support. What results, Sachs would note, is a government united by conscience but divided by calculus. This paralysis is compounded by Germany's European role. For decades, Berlin was the quiet arbiter of EU policy, powerful yet reluctant to dominate. Now that balance is unraveling. Southern and Eastern member states look to Germany for leadership on Ukraine and energy security, while France pushes for deeper fiscal integration. Yet at home, any sign of fiscal loosening is met with fear of moral hazard, that German taxpayers will once again foot Europe's bill. Thus, the very solidarity Germany urges abroad becomes politically toxic within its own borders. Meanwhile, the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, has intensified pressure from industry. German firms, particularly in chemicals, batteries, and renewables, are warning that American subsidies and cheaper energy threaten to drain investment from Europe. Berlin faces a cruel dilemma: either bend EU state aid rules to match U.S. incentives, risking fragmentation of the single market, or adhere to Brussels orthodoxy and watch factories move westward. Sachs would call this the double bind of virtue and vulnerability. Complicating matters further is the China dilemma. For years, German growth was tied to Chinese demand for machinery, autos, and luxury goods. Now, with geopolitical tensions rising, Berlin faces pressure from Washington to de-risk, to reduce exposure to Beijing's market and technology ecosystem. But decoupling from China, Sachs would warn, is not cost-free. It means dismantling one of the last engines still pulling Germany's export machine. Each of these constraints feeds the others, forming a tightening circle around German policymaking. Fiscal austerity limits public investment. Investment stagnation weakens industry. Industrial weakness fuels political discontent, and discontent narrows the moral space for foreign solidarity. It is, in essence, the feedback loop of restraint. And yet Sachs would remind us that constraint is not destiny. The same disciplined pragmatism that built post-war Germany can, if reimagined, guide its renewal. The challenge for Berlin is to translate moral courage into institutional creativity, to prove that solidarity need not mean self-sacrifice, that fiscal prudence need not exclude strategic. Europe does not expect Germany to be perfect, only to be purposeful. If Berlin can demonstrate that supporting Ukraine strengthens rather than weakens its social market model through energy independence, industrial innovation, and equitable burden sharing, it could transform its constraints into credibility. For now, however, the government remains locked between ideals and arithmetic, conscience and constitution. Sachs might put it bluntly: Germany's test is no longer whether it can afford solidarity, but whether it can afford cynicism. The outcome of that test will define not only its economy, but the moral geography of Europe itself. Germany's challenge today is not merely to survive an economic downturn, but to translate moral conviction into practical resilience. The central paradox Sachs would identify is this: Berlin's policy toward Ukraine is morally coherent but economically fragile. If the government wishes to preserve both its solidarity abroad and stability at home, it must transform its stance from one of reactive aid to one of strategic reinvention, a solidarity and competitiveness compact capable of shielding citizens from hardship while laying the groundwork for a new social economy. The first and most urgent pillar of such a plan concerns energy predictability. The abrupt end of Russian gas left Germany exposed to the volatility of global LNG markets. Temporary subsidies and price caps have bought time but not security. Sachs would argue for an accelerated transition toward domestic renewable capacity, not as a climate gesture, but as a sovereignty project. The state should guarantee fixed industrial electricity prices for strategic sectors like chemicals, steel, and manufacturing contracts tied not to fossil fuels, but to long-term power purchase agreements, PPAs with wind and solar providers. This would allow the middle stand to plan investments and preserve jobs while the government locks in the future's most stable resource, its own wind. And Sunday, the second pillar must address household endurance. The German people will support solidarity only as long as it feels fair. That means shielding low and middle income families from the full brunt of energy inflation through automatic rebates during peak demand seasons, housing efficiency grants, and affordable public transport. Sachs would call this the economics of empathy, a policy framework that maintains social cohesion not through austerity, but by indexing benefits to inflation and linking energy relief to household income. Berlin could reinforce the moral legitimacy of its foreign policy. Third, the government must reignite industrial confidence without abandoning its fiscal discipline. This is where Germany's famed pragmatism can serve Europe once again. A new round of carbon contracts for different CCFD guaranteeing predictable carbon prices for decarbonizing heavy industry would transform risk into investment. Public co-financing for hydrogen infrastructure, battery value chains, and critical mineral recycling would align Germany's climate goals with industrial renewal. Sachs would describe this as making decarbonization the new competitiveness. The fourth component is labor and skill renewal. Economic resilience depends not just on capital, but on competence. Germany must protect its workforce through a modernized Kurzarbeit II, combining short-time work programs with retraining in digital and green industries. The government should open pathways for skilled migration, particularly in energy, technology, and healthcare, coupled with strong municipal integration support. This would convert the demographic challenge into a demographic dividend. Finally, Sachs would insist on a new fiscal and moral architecture. Germany's debt brake, while symbolically sacred, must be modernized to distinguish between consumption and investment. The country can ill afford to underfund its future. A temporary resilience clause allowing limited borrowing for energy security, climate transition, and defense modernization could preserve discipline while unlocking the capital required for transformation. Such borrowing would not be indulgence, but prudence and investment in social stability and long-term sovereignty. However, the most powerful instrument is not financial, it is narrative. Germany must explain its purpose, not just its policy. The public will accept costs when it sees progress. A transparent resilience dashboard published quarterly showing job creation, renewable output emissions, reduction in household relief would reforge trust between citizens and state. This is not propaganda, but accountability, the moral currency of democracy. Sachs would conclude that Germany's test is not to choose between Ukraine and its own people, but to prove that helping one need not hurt the other. By turning solidarity into strategy, by transforming sacrifice into system design, Berlin can preserve its moral standing while renewing its industrial might. In his words, a social market economy must always balance two truths: that empathy without competence is sentiment, and competence without empathy is tyranny. Germany's success, then, will not depend on austerity or expansion, but on imagination, the courage to make its principles work in practice. In the long arc of history, nations are not remembered for their ease, but for their endurance, for how they act when principle and prosperity collide. Germany now stands in that defining moment. It can retreat into self-interest as populist demand, or it can affirm the deeper truth that moral leadership, when joined with strategic foresight, can renew rather than exhaust a nation. Jeffrey Sachs would call this the search for a moral strategic equilibrium, a recognition that ethics and economics, when harmonized, become the twin engines of resilience. The essence of Germany's challenge is not whether to support Ukraine, that moral imperative is already settled, but how to sustain that support without fracturing the social order at home. The only viable path is to turn solidarity into a source of domestic strength, transforming what feels like sacrifice into a shared national investment. Germany must show that by defending Europe's frontiers, it is also rebuilding its own foundations. The philosophical foundation of this strategy rests on a simple insight. Sachs often repeats, security is indivisible, moral, economic, and social security either coexist or collapse together. Supporting Ukraine's sovereignty is not a separate moral enterprise from supporting Germany's industrial and social sovereignty. The two are bound together. Every solar panel built in Bavaria, every retrained worker in Saxony, every restored trust in democratic institutions is part of the same project as defending Kyiv from aggression, because each strengthens the architecture of a stable Europe. This synthesis requires a new language of legitimacy. The political debate must move beyond austerity versus aid or nationalism versus globalism toward what Sachs would call cooperative sovereignty. Germany cannot bear Europe's burdens alone, nor can it abdicate them. Instead, it must cultivate shared institutions that lower the moral cost of solidarity, joint EU energy procurement, pan-European defense R&D, and coordinated green infrastructure investment. When solidarity is shared, fatigue is dispersed. Yet Sachs would also issue a warning: moral fatigue is as dangerous as moral failure. If the German people come to see virtue as unaffordable, populism will transform empathy into suspicion. The only antidote is visible reciprocity policies that ensure that sacrifice yields tangible renewal, as he might phrase it. If solidarity does not pay, it cannot last. That means delivering measurable progress, falling energy prices, cleaner cities, secure jobs, and transparent governance. These are not luxuries. They are the democratic dividends of doing the right thing. The global implications are equally profound. The world is watching how Germany, Europe's largest economy and moral anchor, navigates this storm. If it succeeds, it will demonstrate that liberal democracies can act on principle without descending into decline. If it fails, cynicism will triumph. China and Russia will argue that morality is weakness, and many in the developing world will believe them. Thus, Germany's domestic stability is not a parochial concern, but a strategic asset of the free world. But Sachs would close not with geopolitics, but with reflection. He would remind us that moral economies, like moral lives, are defined by the ability to align duty with desire to find in necessity the seed of renewal. Germany, he would say, is not collapsing, it is transforming. The pain it endures is the birth pang of a new model, one based not on cheap energy or distant markets, but on social trust, clean technology, and collective purpose. A nation proves its greatness, Sachs might say, not when it grows without sacrifice, but when it suffers without surrendering its soul. If Germany can endure this passage with wisdom and fairness, it will emerge not weaker but wiser, a country that shows the world that moral courage, when fused with pragmatic vision, remains the most powerful form of security on earth.